Spring Boot 50 Interview Questions and Answers 1. What is Spring Boot and how is it different from the Spring Framework? Spring Boot is a framework built on top of Spring that simplifies application setup by providing auto configuration and embedded servers. Unlike plain Spring, it removes XML configuration and reduces boilerplate. 2. What are the advantages of using Spring Boot? Faster development, less configuration, embedded servers, production-ready features, actuator, wide ecosystem. 3. What is the purpose of Spring Boot application annotation? It combines @configuration, @enable auto configuration, and component scan into one annotation. 4. How does Spring Boot provide embedded servers? Which servers does it support? It bundles servers like Tomcat, Jetty, Undertow so you can run applications with Java Bash Jar. 5. What are Spring Boot starters and why are they useful? Predefined dependency sets like Spring Boot Starter-Web to avoid manual version management. 6. What is the role of Spring Boot Initializer? Spring Initializer, start.spring.io generates project structure with required dependencies. 7. How does Spring Boot reduce boilerplate configuration? Through auto configuration and sensible defaults. 8. What is the difference between application.properties and application.yml? Both are for configuration. .properties is key value format, .yml is hierarchical and more readable. 9. How do you create a simple Spring Boot application from scratch? Use Spring Initializer, Spring Boot application, write REST controller, run with Spring application.run. 10. Explain about the bean scopes. Scopes, singleton, prototype, request, session, application, WebSocket. 11. What is inversion of control, IOC, in Spring? IOC means objects are created managed by Spring Container, not manually by developer. 12. What is dependency injection, DI, and how does it work in Spring Boot? DI is providing objects that a class depends on instead of creating them manually. Spring injects beans automatically. 13. What are the different types of dependency injection in Spring Boot? Constructor-based, setter-based, field injection. 14. Difference between @inject, @autowired, and @resource. @autowired, Spring-specific by type. Inject, JSR 330, similar to @autowired. @resource, JSR 250 by name. 15. What is the role of AutoWired and how does it resolve dependencies? It autowires a matching bean by type and by name if multiple candidates exist. 16. What is the difference between @component, service, and repository? All are stereotypes. @service, business logic, @repository, DAO layer. @component, generic. 17. How do you manually define a bean using @bean annotation? Inside a @configuration class, define a method annotated with a bean returning object. 18. What is the difference between primary and qualifier annotations? @primary, default bean if multiple exist. @qualifier, specify which bean to inject. 19. Difference between constructor-based DI compared to setter-based DI. Constructor DI ensures immutability and mandatory dependencies. Setter DI is flexible for optional dependencies. 20. How can you inject values into a bean using value annotation? Use value property.name to inject values from application properties or systemenv. 21. How do you create a REST API in Spring Boot? Use a REST controller. Define a getMapping @postmapping methods. 22. What is @REST controller and how is it different from @controller? @REST controller plus controller, plat response body. It directly returns JSON XML. 23. What is @request body and how does it work? It binds HTTP request JSON XML body to a Java object. 24. What is path variable and how is it different from request param? @path variable extracts value from URL path. @request param extracts value from query string. 25. How do you handle exceptions in Spring Boot? Use @exception handler in controllers or @controller advice globally. 26. How do you enable CORS in Spring Boot? Use @cross-origin annotation or configure WebMVC configurer. 27. What is response entity and when should you use it? A wrapper around response data with status, headers, body. Use it for full control over HTTP response. 28. How do you implement request validation using @valid and @validated? Annotate request DTO fields with @notnull, size, etc. Use a valid and controller method parameters. 29. How do you document APIs using Swagger OpenAPI? Integrate SpringDoc, OpenAPI, or SpringFox, annotations like @operation, @apply response. 30. How can you limit the rate of API requests in Spring Boot? Use rate limiter libraries like Bucket4j, Resilience4j, or API gateway throttling. 31. What is Spring Data JPA and how does it simplify database operations? It provides repository interfaces, JPA repository, to reduce boilerplate CRUD SQL. 32. How do you configure a database connection in Spring Boot? Add data source details in application.properties, spring.datasource.url, etc. 33. How do you use entity, @table, @column in JPA? @entity marks class as table, @table, table name, @column map field to column. 34. What is the difference between CRUD repository, JPA repository, and paging and sorting repository? CRUD repository, basic CRUD. Paging and sorting repository, CRUD plus pagination sorting. JPA repository, all above plus JPA specific features. 35. How does lazy loading and eager loading work in JPA? Lazy, fetch only when accessed. Eager, fetch immediately with parent. 36. What are the different types of relationships in JPA? At one-to-one, one-to-many, many-to-one, at many-to-many. 37. What is the N+1 problem in JPA and how can you fix it? Multiple queries for related entities. Fix with fetch join or entity graph. 38. How do you implement database migrations in Spring Boot? Use Flyway, spring.flyway.enable true or Liquibase. 39. How does Spring Boot integrate with Redis for caching? Add Spring Boot starter data Redis. Enable caching with enable caching. Configure Redis. 40. How do you perform custom queries using a query annotation? Use query, select u from user u where u.name equals .1 inside repository. 41. What is Spring Security and why is it used? Security framework for authentication and authorization. 42. How do you implement basic authentication in Spring Boot? Configure Spring Security Starter. Define in-memory user details manager or DB. 43. What is JWT and how does it work in Spring Security? JSON Web Token is a token with claims signed and sent with requests for stateless authentication. 44. What is OAuth 2 and how can you implement it in Spring Boot? OAuth 2 is authorization framework. 8. Spring Security provides OAuth 2 login and resource server support. 45. How do you define role-based access control RBAC in Spring Security? Use @preauthorize has role admin or configure in HTTP security. 46. What is Spring Boot Actuator and why is it useful? Provides production-ready monitoring endpoints like health metrics. 47. How do you enable and configure Actuator endpoints? Add Spring Boot Starter Actuator, configure in application.properties. 48. How can you monitor a Spring Boot application using Actuator? Access Actuator/health, Actuator metrics, integrate with Prometheus Grafana. 49. What are the important Actuator endpoints? Actuator health, Actuator's metrics, Actuator env, Actuator/loggers. 50. How do you secure Actuator endpoints in a Spring Boot application? Configure Spring Security to restrict access or expose only selected endpoints.